I'd like to introduce Noreen Fuller. She's CEO of Sweetgrass Galleries, and she and her partner have donated all of the drawing prizes today, these beautiful arrangements.
Well, good afternoon, and it's so great to see everyone here. This is the enthusiastic group, which it's always a pleasure to be with. Makes you feel proud to be a Republican. Peace through strength. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. When you can't make them see the light, make them feel the heat. Many of us today long to hear such words of strength in our leaders. Leaders who promote an America defined by freedom, true democracy, and human dignity. Fortunately, our guests today are keeping President Reagan's legacy and vision alive. William Inboden is professor and director of the Alexander Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. He is a newcomer to the state of Florida from Texas, so we have to welcome him and show him around. He previously served as William Powers Jr. Chair and Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security and Associate Professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, both at the University of Texas, Austin. Inboden's other current roles include Associate with the National Intelligence Council, member of the CIA Historical Advisory Panel, member of the State Department's Historical Advisory Council, and Senior Fellow with Trinity Forum. Previously, he served as Senior Director for Strategic Planning on the National Security Council at the White House and at the Department of State as a member of the Policy Planning Staff and Special Advisor in the Office of International Religious Freedom, and as a staff member both on the United States Senate and House of Representatives. He also served as head of the London-based Legatum Institute and as a Civitas Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Inboden's newest book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, is his latest book, and obviously we will be talking about that today. He has received multiple teaching awards, including recognition received multiple as a Texas 10 by the Texas Execs Alumni Association, selection as Lecturer of the Year at the LBJ School, and his classes, Presidential Decision-Making in National Security and Ethics in International Affairs, were voted as best class in the LBJ School and class most likely to challenge your assumptions. Inboden received his PhD and his master's degrees in history from Yale University and his AB in history with honors from Stanford. Will, we thank you for being here today. Our next guest is David Trulio. He is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, the sole entity created by President Reagan charged with advancing his legacy and his principles. Mr. Trulio oversees a globally recognized nonpartisan organization based in Simi Valley, California, with an institute in Washington, D.C., that delivers distinctive public policy programming, issue-driven forums, and a policy and educational initiatives with national and international impact. The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute also sustains the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum, the most visited presidential library. Mr. Trulio most recently was managing editor and head of strategy and editorial operations at Fox News Digital. We all know what a success that is. Previously, he had extensive experience as a leader in both the U.S. government and defense sector. In the prior presidential administration, he served at the Export-Import Bank of the United States as a counselor to the chairman and senior vice president for the program on China and transformational exports. Earlier, at the Department of Defense, Mr. Trulio served as senior advisor and chief of staff to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. His responsibilities included serving as executive director of the Defense Policy Board, and he performed the duties of Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Prior to his most recent public service, Mr. Trulio was a vice president at Lockheed Martin International. He joined Lockheed Martin from Raytheon Company, where he had multiple senior roles, including director of operations at Raytheon International. Mr. Trulio earned an MBA from Harvard Business School and a JD from Columbia and a BA in Public and International Affairs from Princeton. Please help me welcome David Trulio.
Well, what a treat and honor it is to be within a room full of energized, organized Republican women. This is fantastic. So thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Noreen. I couldn't be more thrilled to be here. And well, we're going to do a little tiny bit of show and tell, and then we're going to have a really great discussion with Will here in just a moment. But show of hands, how many people have been to the Reagan Library? Okay. Doing okay. But hopefully we'll do better in a little bit. So as was touched on a moment ago, we are the sole organization that President Reagan set up to advance his legacy and his principles. And what are those principles? Specifically, individual liberty, economic opportunity, freedom and democracy, peace through strength, and national pride. So those are timeless principles. They're proven, and they're in desperate need. The country's in desperate need of having them imparted very, very widely from those little kids we saw, those little kid patriots doing the reading, to folks of all ages and persuasions. So I wanted to show you a couple of quick photos. So this is where I get to go to work every day. It's in Simi Valley, California, about 45 to 60 minutes north of Los Angeles or north of Los Angeles International Airport. We house the plane that President Reagan flew to 26 countries around the world. That's in that big white building at the top of the screen. That's our Air Force One pavilion. We have sweeping views of the hills and all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. It's a really spectacular setting. It has the final resting place of the President and Mrs. Reagan, and it has the piece of the Berlin Wall that President Reagan had there delivered in 1990, and there's a great picture of him receiving it. And literally every day I'm in my office, I see little kids on tour groups and other groups go up to that wall, touch that wall. We're seeing the freedom side of the wall, where people could protest and put graffiti on the wall. If you walk around it, you'll see the soul-crushing, soul-destroying bleakness of that concrete slab, keeping people prisoners in their own country. We have, as I mentioned, the Air Force One pavilion. So that is the plane. It's a 707. It's before the president got to use a 747. But you can literally go inside, and it's quite impressive to old and young when you're inside. And we also have a Marine One helicopter, which is really neat. And it's also the place where we hosted the Republican presidential candidate debate. It's the fifth debate that we had that was back in September. And it was the fifth time we've done it, and a very, very special place. So we produce extensive public affairs programming, issue-driven forums, both in person and online, from our Simi Valley campus and our institute in Washington, D.C. Part of that programming involved interviewing your governor, which was a lot of fun. He came. Let's give a hand for Ron DeSantis. So he came and did a book talk back in March, and then for the presidential debate, I actually interviewed all 7 debaters, and this was my interview with Governor DeSantis. And crucially, everything we do, as much as humanly possible, we put online on our YouTube channel, on Instagram, on Twitter, so it lives forever. And that's extremely important, because even though we get hundreds of thousands of visitors in person every year, we want We want to reach millions of people, the millions of people who will not set foot on our campus. Part of what we do as well is the Reagan National Defense Forum. That is the premier convening of national defense leaders promoting peace through strength. And we back in December, we had our 10th one. All the way on the left, you see Florida Congressman Mike Waltz, and he's on a panel with the General Richardson, who's the commander of Southcom based in Miami, and General Nakasone, the commander of Cybercom, and other leaders. You see them there as well. And then we also had General Alvin, who is Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and Chief of Naval Operations Franchetti, and Jim Takelet, the CEO of Lockheed Martin. So again, a very vibrant set of policy discussions. And this was my interview of General Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when he came out for the Defense Forum. We had Speaker McCarthy and President Tsai of Taiwan. This was back in April. President Tsai was going to speak in the United States, and Speaker McCarthy, whose district is not too far from the Reagan Library, he and President Tsai agreed that a place for her to speak and for them to meet would be perfect was the Reagan Library. By the way, President Tsai of Taiwan, she's been to the Reagan Library multiple times and is very good at invoking President Reagan's principles, and it's very powerful. The Chinese government did not like that, so we were sanctioned by the Chinese government. They did not like us standing up for freedom and democracy. So I think I should put that in my bio, that we've been sanctioned under my watch, which is something I certainly think is something to be proud of. President Reagan's birthday was mentioned, and it was on Tuesday, and I couldn't have been prouder of our organization. So this photo is from Tuesday. Does anybody recognize who this is? Who is it? It's Lech Walesa. That's right. So he was our featured speaker for President Reagan's birthday. And every year we do a celebration. A wreath is laid at the final resting place. And I just couldn't resist. I had to put a selfie up of me with President Walesa by the Berlin Wall. Again, you saw the Berlin Wall piece there earlier. So in terms of public affairs program, we have Rand Paul on February 20th. Governor Sununu on March 20th. So February 20th and then March 20th. I referenced earlier the Washington, D.C. location, the Reagan Institute. That's where Bob and Michelle are based. In 2022, we opened a permanent home for the Reagan Foundation, the Reagan Institute in Washington. So it's located right next to the White House, in the belly of the beast, by the Hay Adams Hotel. It's where we promote President Reagan's ideals, his vision, and his leadership example for all people of all levels of education and experience. And particularly, we do a lot of youth education programs, academic alliances, scholarly work, and again, more extensive public affairs programming. We have a huge video wall to entice people on 16th Street, actually formerly 16th Street, it's now Black Lives Matter Plaza. But anybody walking around, there's a gigantic 20-foot video screen beaming Ronald Reagan into Black Lives Matter Plaza. So we're very proud of that. So these are examples of some of the policy work we've done. You see our Institute Director, Roger Zackheim, some very, very serious policy work. That's Senator Jim Talent on a panel discussion about AI and biosecurity. So again, really important. Twice a year, the foundation has special exhibits at our museum in California. We had a very serious, very somber, very important, and unfortunately extremely timely special exhibit over the last 10 months called Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, that had 700 artifacts, 400 photos that really tells the story of what happens when people turn a blind eye to hate, talks about the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews, and the murder of millions of other people. That's an actual 1930s era German train car. We don't know if it was used to take, that specific car was used to take people to their deaths, but it was out front. And again, in this specific case, over 204,000 people came and saw the exhibit. And then we did a ton of events that magnify the impact of that, and all of those live online. Our next, here you see some of the artifacts, a woman's shoe from a woman who was deported. I mean, incredibly powerful and tragic. And I'll just click through. These are obviously photos of the people who were held against their will, and many of them tragically, ultimately murdered at Auschwitz. But on a much more uplifting note, we will have our next exhibit is going to be called Defending America and the Galaxy, Star Wars and the Strategic Defense Initiative. And we hope you all come for that. We're going to get into Star Wars here in a moment. But last year alone, the Reagan Foundation reached hundreds of thousands of young people through our educational programming. You see some pictures here. This is our Great Communicator Debate program. We have virtual field trips, actual field trips, classroom curricula, college scholarships programs. These are kids doing a simulation of either our Grenada invasion scenario or our Korean airliner shoot-down educational experience. Here they are in the White House Situation Room replica. Here they are in the 3/4 size Oval Office replica. They're role-playing. They each have different roles. Here we are in our White House press room. Students are assigned to be members of the press. And then here the president, in quotes, is standing at the podium getting grilled by his classmates. So it's a lot of fun. But again, the key here is that we want to not only reach tens of thousands of kids in person, but we want to take this online, and we're well down a path of doing that. This is some of our educational programs in Washington. We have the boot camps on economics, boot camps on peace through strength. That's actually Gina Haspel, the former CIA director. So that shows you the kind of caliber of people we're able to get for our programs. So we are extremely excited to be here to build community. This is actually much more than about Simi Valley and Washington, but we want to really foster, we have a nationwide community of supporters, but we want to foster more connectivity. There are ways to do that through our Reagan Network, through our National Leadership Council, but do come see us in Washington, see us in California, but also know that having support in real America here in Florida is really, really important. So I'm so grateful to Kathy and to the whole team for having us. And I think this is a perfect setup for the conversation we're going to have now with Will. Will was at our inaugural Age of Reagan conference, where we pulled together over 100 academics who are doing research work, original writing, scholarly work on President Reagan's presidency. By the way, they don't all agree on President Reagan. It's not some kind of love fest for Reagan. It's truly the kind of dynamic intellectual forum. Those are exact words that President Reagan used when he set up the foundation and the library. And I will just brag on Will a little bit. He was the inaugural winner of our Age of Reagan Conference Book Prize. His book is truly spectacular. It sets a new standard for presidential scholarship. It's tremendously accessible to anybody, from a casual reader to the most serious of scholars. And someone said that it's been appropriately described as the authoritative, comprehensive history of the Reagan administration's foreign policy. So I couldn't be more pleased to be here today with you and with Will, and to have a really great discussion right now. So let's just give another hand for Will. Okay, Will, without build-up, why did you write this book?
Well, this is on, right? You can,
yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dave, for those kind words. And I will answer that directly, but I can't resist just adding an extra foot stomp and plug for visiting the Reagan Library. I saw a number of hands in here that you have. The rest of you put it on your bucket list. As far as writing this book, the most enjoyable part of it was researching it, and that meant I spent about 9 months at the Reagan Library over several years, multiple trips, almost so much that I had to become a California taxpayer, which would have been awful. But anyway, so that's the only downside to where the Reagan Library is. So a lot of reasons why I wrote this book, but I want to emphasize two of them. First, as you picked up from my bio, the first part of my career was as a policymaker, primarily in Washington, D.C. And then I kind of had one of those mid-career, midlife crises and decided to become a professor, which I've been doing for 14 years now. First at the University of Texas, and then as of 6 months ago, the University of Florida, just up the highway. And the reason I bring that up is that feeds very directly into why I wrote this book is, I saw over the years of teaching at University of Texas, University of Florida, all of my students were born after the Cold War ended, right? So the Cold War to them might as well be the Civil War, World War I, the Revolution, right? It's just ancient history. But I noticed this mentality that they had picked up, and I think they were maybe getting it from their high school or college classes, that The peaceful end of the Cold War was just inevitable. Of course, the Soviet Union couldn't continue. Of course, it was going to collapse. The United States just kind of got lucky, and it just happened that way. And I knew, having, come of age, I was in junior high and high school during the 1980s, that wasn't true. But I thought someone needs to tell this story for the next generation to remind them that when President Reagan took office with a vision of winning the Cold War, it was very controversial. It wasn't seen as inevitable at all. If anything, most people thought the Soviet Union was stronger than the United States. And President Reagan had tremendous challenges in coming up with this new strategy, which we'll talk about, to peacefully win the Cold War. And so I wanted to write this book for the next generation to remind them of what visionary presidential leadership looks like, to remind them, as President Reagan often reminded us, that while America is the greatest nation in the world, it's not inevitable that will continue, that's an inheritance that's passed forward to each generation. And particularly in foreign policy, there's an important story to tell there. And that's the second reason I wrote this book, is the challenges, the national security threats facing our country have not gone away. They're new and different now than when President Reagan was in office, but there's some really troubling similarities, especially with the threat we face from communist China. And as a former policymaker myself, I know that policymakers can benefit from the insights of history, and there's no better case study in a successful and strong American foreign policy than President Reagan's. And so I want policymakers today to learn from this as well.
I will add, as somebody who's read the book very carefully, Will isn't just a cheerleader for Ronald Reagan. He's very discerning about what worked, what didn't work, what the challenges, what the shortcomings were, which I think only adds to the significance of an impact of the book. Why did you call it The Peacemaker? Tell us the story behind that.
So, this has been one of the most interesting responses to the book, because a lot of people have been, why did you call it The Peacemaker? Especially Reagan haters and Reagan detractors who just thought of him as only this kind of belligerent cowboy warmonger. And I'd say, they say, are you trolling us by calling this peacemaker? No. And there's a number of the theme peacemaker occurs throughout his life and career. But what it comes down to is he was very committed to peace. He wanted a peaceful end to the Cold War. But he's also, for him, that meant peace through strength and peace through an American victory. I wanted to show that those are not incompatible. Like, those align very well. And so he, throughout his presidency and his diaries, which I read extensively, would often refer to his desire to be a peacemaker. This was really the end that he wanted. But the ultimate tribute, and really where I got the title for the book, is that's what Gorbachev called him as well. Gorbachev paid a very special surprise visit to Reagan's casket when he was lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda in 2004 when he died. And then was interviewed by a reporter just after paying tribute at the casket, and Gorbachev said, he was a great friend and was a great peacemaker. And so that tribute coming from the man whose evil empire Reagan had defeated, I thought was really notable. So if Gorbachev can call him that, so can my book.
Amazing. So set the stage for us a little bit more, Will. You start the book with President Reagan's address to the United Kingdom members of Parliament in the Palace of Westminster. So the date is June 8th, 1982. So what was the global context going into that event? What was the significance of what President Reagan did that day?
Yeah, and President Reagan gave so many incredible, iconic speeches throughout his presidency, and I highlight a lot of those in here. But his Westminster address, I do think, is his greatest one. That's why I start the book with it. And it's where, among other things, he prophesies, I use that word deliberately, that Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. Which he was absolutely correct about with the Soviet Union. And
he literally uses that term, ash heap of history.
Yeah, ash heap of history, yeah. But that was incredibly controversial when he said that at the time, because most conventional wisdom, prevailing beliefs were that the Soviet Union was strong and durable, is when it'd been around for 70 years at that point, it was going to be with us for at least another century. And that's where I try to recapture in the book, without comment on anyone's age. I see a few of you here are old enough to remember the Cold War. Okay. And I am as well. It was a terrifying time, right? And for much of it, the United States had a very difficult hand to play. And so when President Reagan was elected and takes the oath of office in January of 81 and then gives a speech next year in 1982, the United States was coming out of a terrible decade with the 1970s. There was the energy crisis from the OPEC oil embargo. There was the, multi-year recession with that awful phenomenon of stagflation, of high unemployment and high inflation. But on the foreign policy front, anyone who was asked in 1980 or 1981, what's the scorecard in the Cold War? Who's winning? Who's losing? Everyone would have said the Soviet Union is winning, the United States is losing. Over the previous decade, communism had advanced on every continent, all right? Laos, South Vietnam, Cambodia, Angola, Ethiopia, South Yemen, Nicaragua, Grenada, Afghanistan had all in the previous decade before Reagan took office fallen to communism, right? Democracy was not advancing, communism was advancing. Our military was demoralized and underfunded. The Soviet military was at the apex of its strength. And so you've got a divided and demoralized America at home. We don't believe in ourselves as a country anymore. Our economy is a mess. Our foreign policy is losing. Not even to mention things like the Iran hostage crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, right? And so when President Reagan takes office, he inherits a terribly difficult set of circumstances, really what looks like a losing hand. And for him to then have the confidence to say, I think we can turn this country around, and I think we can actually not just stabilize, but win this Cold War, was seen as crazy, right? And yet he went out and did just that. And so that's why I try to set that scene at the start of the book so people will realize this wasn't inevitable. He didn't just get lucky, but this comes from visionary leadership and clear policy choices.
And further to your point, President Reagan was also emphatically not somebody who was cavalier about war. In fact, you've said he lived in terror of nuclear annihilation. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? How he perceived nuclear weapons?
Yeah. And this is our mutual friend Paul Leto has also written a great book on this about President Reagan's nuclear doctrine and his really desire ultimately to see all nuclear weapons abolished from the face of the earth. You know, they are terrible weapons, right? I mean, if you're not afraid of nuclear weapons, see us afterwards. Okay. So, and so President Reagan did have a dream of a nuclear free world, but he was very clear that America was not going to unilaterally disarm. The only thing that he loathed more than nuclear weapons was communism. And he knew that you've got to get the sequencing right. You first need to defeat Soviet communism, and then you can start reducing nuclear weapons. But that was really his ultimate vision there was that, you know, our children and future generations wouldn't have to live in terror of nuclear weapons like he and everyone else who came of age during the Cold War did. And that, of course, leads to his Strategic Defense Initiative, the incredibly visionary and controversial program to be able to shoot down all incoming nuclear weapons. And when you look at American forces in the Middle East today, or Israel defending itself from missile and rocket attacks, they're using a lot of the technology that President Reagan and his administration had first pioneered there.
Well, you used the word today. So I'm going to ask you now a few questions that have actually very direct relevance to today. So first off, your book talks about how the Cold War was really a battle of ideas. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important theme in the book and something that I just discovered over and over in my research. And I'll try to summarize it for you like this with a very quick thumbnail sketch of Cold War history. Every Cold War president, from Harry Truman on up through Jimmy Carter, and this includes Republicans like Eisenhower and Nixon, every one of them had more or less conceived of the Cold War the same way, that it is a great power contest. You've got the United States is a strong power and the Soviet Union is a strong power, and we just need to manage that relationship. We need to contain further Soviet expansion, but they're a rival nation to be managed and contained. And President Reagan comes into office with a very different theory of the case. He sees the Cold War as primarily a battle of ideas. And he sees Soviet communism not as a rival nation to be contained, but as a vile, wicked idea to be defeated. And that may sound simple in hindsight, but it was a profound strategic revolution that followed from that he realized the real victory here is not just going to be in targeting the Soviet economy or the Soviet military, although he does that, but it is ending that iniquitous system of Soviet communism. And so this is why when you read his speeches, again, as I read just about all of them over the course of researching this, when you read the transcripts of his meetings with foreign heads of state, especially with Soviet leaders, he is really pressing to delegitimize Soviet communism as a system. So that's why he says it's a bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are now being written. That's why he says it'll end up on the ash heap of history. That's why he calls it an evil empire. That's why he says not just tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. He's reminding everyone that even though the wall was in East Germany, in East Berlin, it had been put there by the Soviets. And so he wanted to delegitimize Soviet communism as a terrible and wicked idea to be defeated and replace it with a much better idea of a free world led by the United States.
So we'll come back to the implications of being assertive in our values. But again, to start to tie things to today, why don't you remind everybody about the Reagan Doctrine, what it is, and what's its relevance to today?
Yeah. So a few minutes ago, when I was giving you the quick overview of the foreign policy challenges and crises of the 1970s, I mentioned all those developing world countries that had fallen to communism, right? And this, of course, is in the wake of America's defeat and then withdrawal and disgrace from Vietnam. And so when President Reagan takes office, the day he takes the oath of office, it is 7 years, almost to the day, after the last American troop had withdrawn from Vietnam, and about 6 years after South Vietnam had fallen to communism. And so the Vietnam War was not distant history for President Reagan. It was yesterday, right? It was still a very fresh, painful wound. And one of the lessons he had taken away from that was, of course, that we cannot be cavalier about deploying American troops abroad without public support, without a clear mission to win. But he also didn't want to adopt the policy that Carter and many of the Democrats had adopted. Well, let's just let communism advance across the world. And so President Reagan came up with the Reagan Doctrine, which is let's support others who are fighting for their freedom. You know, if they want to put their lives on the line in Afghanistan, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Cambodia, in Angola, I could tell you, all of them, if they want to put their lives on the line to fight against communism, we will support them with money and with weapons to do their own fighting. And so for him, it was a moral position of supporting people who want to fight for their freedom, but also a strategic one that he knew that this was a relatively low-cost way for the United States to impose punishing costs in the Soviet Union. The Soviets were spending billions of rubles a year propping up these communist governments and supplying them with weapons. And so Reagan knew that this was a way to impose disproportionate costs on the Soviets, maintain the moral high ground, and not put American forces at risk.
So we will have time for a Q&A a little later, but the obvious implication for today, and there certainly may be very thoughtful and reasonable divergence of views within this room here, but obvious implications for Ukraine today, where America is supplying a group of people who are fighting for themselves and not asking for American ground troops or military personnel. They're asking for supplies. Yeah. Now, in the book, you tell us about the following, which is the largest U.S. naval surface warfare action since World War II. Now, I want everybody to think, what was the largest U.S. naval surface action since World War II? It doesn't necessarily leap out. Does anyone have a guess? Anyone want to throw out what that was? It was not Grenada. Yeah. Okay, Will, take it away.
It was Operation Praying Mantis in 1988 when the U.S. Navy pretty much destroyed the Iranian Navy.
Half of the Iranian Navy was wiped out.
Yeah, it was a pretty small Navy to start with, but yeah. And the backstory, of course, and as Dave mentioned earlier, my book is, as you picked up, it's a very favorable portrait of President Reagan's foreign policy, and deservedly so. But I also try to be honest about some of his failings and missteps. The Iran-Contra affair was one of them. I think there was some policy mistakes that put our Marines at risk in Beirut when 241 were killed by Iranian-sponsored terrorists in 1983. But by his second term, especially by the last couple of years of his presidency, President Reagan had learned from some of those earlier missteps, and he saw that Iranian aggression was continuing. And Iran was then as now sponsoring terrorism against American targets in the region and trying to target international shipping going through the Persian Gulf and the States of Hormuz to try to hold the international economy hostage. And he'd given the Iranians some warnings, and they weren't backing away, and they'd attacked an American ship. And so finally he said, all right, well, we gave them the warning. And so he unleashed Operation Praying Mantis for the U.S. Navy to destroy most of the Iranian Navy. And within a few weeks of that, Iran sued for peace. It ended the Iran-Iraq war. It stopped attacking the shipping, and stability was restored in the region. So I do think there are some lessons there about what it takes to get Tehran's attention.
Yeah, especially literally right now with the with what Iran is doing through proxies.
Yeah.
Let's pivot slightly, but it has huge implications for today. If you can share with us President Reagan's thoughts on economic strength and economic power and its implications.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, when President Reagan takes office in 1981, the American economy is just in disastrous shape. And he has a very ambitious new Cold War strategy, which I described, which he wants to unveil, but he knows that won't work if he doesn't first get the American economy going again. And he needed to do that to keep Americans, he knows his first priority is taking care of the American people, but also if he's going to fund this major defense modernization and build up, we need the American economy growing. And if we're going to outcompete the Soviet Union and their economy and win this battle of ideas, we need to show that a free market, free enterprise economy works better. And so all of those strands go into his efforts to cut taxes, to cut regulation, to rein inflation in, to restore soundness to the dollar, and make the American economy the leading economy in the world. And as he's doing that is putting so much more pressure on the Soviet economy, which is of course inefficient command economy that can't keep pace with Reagan's defense modernization. They don't have any viable trading partners. And again, it goes back to him wanting to win the Cold War battle of ideas. It wasn't just to show that communism is a bad idea. He wanted to show that freedom is a good idea. Free markets, free political systems, religious freedom, all those went together for him. And so his economic strategy was trying to show the virtues of economic freedom. But that also extended to our allies. So he was very favorable to doing trade agreements with our allies. They share our political values. They share our economic values. He thought that would be good for our economy, good for their economies as well, and show kind of the booming prosperity of the free world in contrast to the penury and poverty and misery of the communist world.
Is it fair to say, especially as such a learned historian of the era, that we think a lot about the military buildup without necessarily giving the economic piece the due it deserves, because you can't have the military piece without the economic piece.
Yeah, exactly. And when, as I mentioned, just on the military balance, when Reagan takes office, the Soviets have a stronger and more potent and capable military than we did. But he also had this intuition that they just can't keep pace, that there's no way that miserable, stagnant economy can continue fueling their military expansion. But it hadn't been tested before because Carter had pretty much had a policy of appeasement towards the Soviets and hadn't wanted to pressure them. And so a lot of President Reagan's military buildup and defense modernization was designed to put economic pressure on the Soviets. And again, in hindsight, we can see it worked wonderfully and it makes perfect sense. But I can't stress enough, very few people at the time thought it would work. You can look through the footnotes in the book or even portions of it. All expert opinion, academic opinion, even CIA assessments, think tank opinion. Most other policymakers thought the Soviet economy was strong and durable and could keep going, and that Reagan's policy of pressuring it that way was just lunatic and wasn't going to work. And so he was, I think, tremendously vindicated, of course. But you appreciate it all the more when you realize he was kind of a lone, courageous voice with this new policy.
So there are huge implications for today in terms of the strength of our economy and what it will be able to sustain. Yeah. Now, you said about this era, or today, speaking recently, you said about the era that in some ways it's a 1983 moment in Asia. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? We do face currently a threat and challenge from a nuclear-armed communist country with global ambitions, i.e., China. Yeah. Tell us more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is where I do see there are a number of parallels between the challenges President Reagan faced with the Soviet Union and the challenges we face today with communist China. Right? China is also now growing its nuclear arsenal, just as the Soviets had back then. They have a vision to dominate not just their immediate region, but they're now trying to extend their influence throughout Africa and Latin America. They see the United States as their main rival. Whether or not we see them that way, it's taken us a while to realize that they are our enemy, even though they've been treating us as such for decades now. But it also, I think, is a battle of ideas, right? I mean, Xi Jinping has made very clear that he thinks the American idea, the American model is failing. He doesn't believe in free societies. He doesn't believe in democracy. He doesn't believe in true free enterprise. And he wants to show the rest of the world, as well as his people, the China model of authoritarian control and xenophobic nationalism is the better one. And so I think the United States would do well to take a number of pages from President Reagan's Cold War playbook as we deal with these challenges from China today.
How do you see the current global security environment affecting the national conversation as we head into this crucial election year? Were there any lessons from 1984 or maybe even 1980?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. While most Americans, as we think about the upcoming elections, I think are primarily focused on domestic issues, right? Obviously, our inflation is still not fully reined in. Our economy could be doing better. The immigration, crisis on our southern borders. Just kind of the general demoralization and disunity we feel as a people. Foreign policy is never far away, and we need to remember that we are electing a commander in chief and not just a chief executive with the president. And whether it's the increasing threats from Iran, whether it's the very severe threat from China, whether it's the potential return of jihadist terrorism as a first order threat, as we saw with 9/11. Of course, I'm very concerned about Putin's aggression, not just against Ukraine, but against our NATO allies as well. So foreign policy issues are never far away in this moment, just as they were certainly at the forefront in President Reagan's era.
So we're going to have a quick lightning round of questions of Will, and then we'll turn to questions in a moment. But maybe invite the audience to say, how many times did President Reagan commit ground troops in combat? Anybody have a number in mind? How many times? Okay, I see the right answer over there. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, just once in Grenada. It would, a small Operation Urgent Fury over in a weekend. That was the first time the United States had deployed ground troops in combat since Vietnam. And so it's a big psychological hurdle to get over. But President Reagan, even while he was very supportive of our military and did a tremendous amount to restore morale there, and of course to dramatically increase the military budget, he was also very careful about the use of force. And again, had learned some hard lessons there from the Vietnam generation. And so Grenada was the only time he actually did. And then this goes back to, for him, peace through strength wasn't just a slogan. It was a doctrine. It was a strategy. And he knew that if the United States, restored our military strength, that's the best way to deter aggression and to maintain peace and not to have to send the troops into harm's way again.
So the next question is, maybe I'll throw this out there and then we'll react. But Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines, Chile, El Salvador, Argentina, Brazil, all of those countries had something in common in this era. What was it?
Do you want me to
take it away?
They all went through peaceful democratic transitions. They all became democracies under President Reagan's watch during the 1980s. Again, this is an important theme in my book, and something that we don't fully appreciate about him or that time is he didn't just want to bring freedom to the Soviet Union and to Eastern Europe, the people behind the Iron Curtain and certainly behind the Berlin Wall. He was very committed to that, but he wanted to support freedom around the rest of the world as well. And he had inherited some challenges with a number of America's allies and partners were, anti-communists such as South Korea and Taiwan, the Philippines, and others we mentioned. But they were also pretty thuggish military dictatorships, and they were starting to lose the trust and confidence of their own people. And President Reagan had seen with the Iranian Revolution in 1979 or the Nicaraguan one in 1979 that if a right-wing dictator loses the trust of his own people, he can be susceptible to a terrible revolution to bring in something much, much worse. And so President Reagan very deftly kept close ties and support to our different allies and partners, but also gently but firmly encouraged them to democratize and showed that democracy isn't just a system of government for predominantly white nations in Western Europe and the United States, but that in Asia, in Latin America, and elsewhere, that there is a hunger for freedom, and that with the people need to want it themselves, right? They need to take ownership for it. Each of those countries as it did, but the United States can lend some quiet but clear support there, and that again was part of his bigger strategy of winning that battle of ideas in the Cold War.
So I'm going to invite everybody to get their questions ready. And before we turn to audience questions, I have to ask and want everybody to know, Will, tell us about your relatively new role as a professor and director of the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida, from which you drove 5 hours ago all morning. But tell us about the new role. You were crushing it in Texas at the Clements Center, but you're in this really important, really consequential new role. Why don't you tell everybody about it?
Okay, thanks. Well, and I'll even tie it into the closing in the book. So the book ends with one of President Reagan's final speeches in public life at the Oxford Union in December of 1992. And he also invokes the word peacemaker there. There was a Harvard student who was doing a study abroad at Oxford in December of 1992 who slept out overnight to wait in line to get tickets to be able to see President Reagan's final speech. And that Harvard student was Ben Sasse, who then became a U.S. Senator and is now the president of the University of Florida and is also one of my oldest and closest friends. And so even though I was loving life in Texas for 13 years, about 6-7 months ago after Ben had become president of the University of Florida, he called up, he says, all right, Inboden, you up to moving to Gainesville and joining our merry band here and helping me get this Hamilton Center launched? I said, all right, Ben, count me in. So the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education was created at the University of Florida about 18 months ago. Governor DeSantis led the way in creating it, as did the Florida legislature. And the idea is this. All of you have seen the utter lunacy and toxicity and ideological rot going on in so many universities today, right? And it's been there for a long time. It's become even worse since October 7th. And we need to do a lot to rein that back in. But we also need to do some positive things. We need to remind the rest of the country of what university education is supposed to be about in America, teaching students about Western civilization, teaching them the principles of the American founding, educating the next generation, not just to be consumers or employees, but to be citizens of our great republic, and to have the right virtues and values that we need for self-government to survive. And that is the mission of the Hamilton Center. So we are hiring a lot of like-minded faculty. We're developing a curriculum and great books in the American founding. We've already got about 600 Florida students taking our initial spate of classes, but we're going to be introducing a number of new majors and degrees over the next year or two. So it's very exciting to be a part of this. I've been a Floridian for 6 months now. I'm still getting to know my new state, your state, but I love it so far. And very excited about what we're doing up there in Gainesville. So as I found out this morning, this is a bit of a drive, but please, and I'll be seeing again this afternoon when I go back, but please do come and see us sometime. And we certainly would welcome your support and applause for what I think is a really important effort. And I'm honored to be a part of it.
Great. Let's give a hand to Will. Okay, questions. This is not a shy group. I see one over there. Great.
This is great. Thank you very much. I'm a little vague, actually very vague, on dates. The date of Reagan's death and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the USSR. It would be a shame if he missed it. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I can answer the first part definitively. He died on June 5th, 2004. And the 20th anniversary of that is coming up this June, which is going to be a very significant opportunity for us to remember his accomplishments and also, as he, I think, would want us to look forward. So actually, on June 5th and June 6th at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, we're going to have the commemoration of his passing, but also a set of reflections and a celebration of the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion and the 40th anniversary of the Point du Hoc speech, that's June 6th. So we're going to do 2 days worth of events. So again, you're all officially invited to that. Yeah. The Berlin Wall, of course, fell in 1989. So
November 11th, 1989. And then the Soviet Union officially dissolved on Christmas Day, 1991.
Right. And President Reagan did receive that piece of the Berlin Wall, the picture of which you saw, in 1990. So really within literally months of it falling, there was a piece at the Reagan Library. So really,
and it was torn down just about 2.5 years after he had said tear down this wall. Yeah. So
he said that speech in November of 1987, and then within basically 2 years, it had fallen. Did we answer all your questions? Okay, great.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was excellent. I am really excited to hear what you're doing at the University of Florida. I think it sounds novel because of what is going on with our university systems now. And it sounds exactly what our country needs in higher level education. I'm curious because we all know that our university towns tend to be, the most leftist of our entire states. How has your reception been with the faculty and staff, considering the conservative nature of your movement?
So, not everyone hates us. So I'll start with that, right? So, yeah. Look. I mean, it is just a demographic fact that university faculties are overwhelmingly politically left leaning at just about any university. This was the case at University of Texas, and certainly is the case at University of Florida. You can find in the student newspaper, other local press, plenty of unflattering or unfavorable quotes about the Hamilton Center and my arrival from other, Florida faculty. But I'll say there's a good news story here too, and this is where I'm encouraged. Is when you plant a flag and when you stand up and say we're here with this mission and we want to restore civil discourse and viewpoint diversity and freedom of speech and free inquiry to university campuses. A surprising number of people will come out of the woodwork who and say, "Hey, we like that, and we want to support you, and we want to work with you on that," including other faculty who had perhaps felt cowed or intimidated into silence or hunkering down over the past few years, but now want to be a part of something. And so there's a good news story there too. And then my message has been, I'm not going to try to get into, I don't really do much social media. I'm not going to get into a talking points fight with, other faculty on campus who may not like what we're doing. My message has been, I want the quality of our work to speak for itself. I want the, number of students who are going to be taking our classes, the excellence and rigor and insights of the scholarship that our faculty are producing, the fact that we will practice what we preach and encouraging, free and open and civil discourse in our classrooms. We think if we build something positive like that we're not going to win over everyone. And if you don't have a few enemies, you're not making a difference. Okay. So, that the critics are always going to be there, but I hope that it'll help restore some sanity and balance to campus. And that will be something that, everyone at University of Florida can take pride in.
And to put a fine point on it, there's the army you have, but you're also building an army, right? Yeah. So you're recruiting and you're shaping. Yeah. So there's a really exciting building piece of this that's not just adapting something that pre-existed.
We have, and some of this predates me, but we have received over 1,100 applications at the Hamilton Center for faculty positions. That's over 1,100 professors across the country who want to join us. Yeah. So
spread the word. Yeah, spread the word for faculty, but also for applicants. Yeah. Right. People who know young people who are in. It's college and graduate school, or is it just undergrads?
Right now, just undergraduates, but in a few years, we'll be starting some graduate programs too. So we have big plans, and I think what University of Florida is really well positioned to lead a movement across the country to restore some sanity and balance in higher ed.
I see a question over here and then over there.
Yeah, I'm really excited about what you're doing, and I think the hardest part right now, at least from where I sit, is sometimes having those conversations with the other side and trying to figure out how do we make a difference and try to steer people. And I read the book on Reagan, and don't ask me who wrote it, but I remember one line out of that. And I just recently was talking to somebody in my family's girlfriend who's very liberal. And I kind of got her to make some movement. And I used the line that Reagan was a Democrat and that he said that when he switched over, he didn't leave the party left him. And he talked about how when he was trying to save money, how he wanted to give it back to the people. And the people said, no, you've got to keep that earmarked. And so I went through some stories like that. And it was so funny. My nephew comes over and he goes, how are you talking politics to her? And he goes, she is totally the other side. And she said, no, your aunt's really smart. She said, she's talking about Reagan and all this. And I said, you know what? This just made me realize that I think we can have conversations with people if we keep out of. And every time she started to talk about a name of somebody in politics, I just said, no, we can't talk that. We're just talking about what we believe on beliefs. And so I just kind of feel like there's a way that we should be able to impact students and people getting away from, Republican, Democrat, just kind of talking. And I think the fact that he was both sides kind of made her go like, oh, okay, I'll listen to you a little bit. So I say that to you just because it was just a thought of how do we get having those conversations with the other side to try to get them maybe a little bit over? I don't know.
I've got to share a brief story from the book that I think will really reinforce this point. The Boys of Point du Hoc story. So this is one of my favorite things I uncovered in my research, and I use it. It's a story that I think powerfully illustrates how President Reagan was very firm in his conservative principles, but he wanted to unite the country. He wanted to bring as many people along as possible, and he always remembered that the Democrats may be his political adversaries or opponents, but they weren't his enemies, right? They were his fellow Americans. So June 6th, 1984, Dave mentioned it earlier. It's the 40th anniversary of the D-Day invasion at Normandy. President Reagan goes over to Point du Hoc, the iconic cliffs overlooking the Normandy beaches where the 2nd Ranger Battalion had scaled the cliffs to take out the Nazi gun emplacements at the top. And President Reagan has brought about 60 or so of the surviving Rangers back now to the top of those cliffs where he's going to give this speech. And in the United States, then is election season. So the Democrats had nominated Walter Mondale to challenge Reagan for the 1984 presidency. So he knows that Mondale is going to be his opponent. So as President Reagan is coming to that wonderful peroration in the speech where he's got the Rangers in front of him, he says, "These are the boys of Point du Hoc. These are the men who freed a continent. These are the soldiers who saved a world," right? I watch it on YouTube if you don't remember it. I still, cry every time I watch it. And he's got the Rangers sitting in front of them. The speech was being broadcast live across the United States by all the major networks. And there was an office building in Boston, and a group of about 50 or 60 of the office workers had gathered around the office TV to watch the speech. And as President Reagan comes to that line, one of them starts crying. One of these office workers starts crying. He said he looks around, he sees that all his fellow colleagues, all his fellow staff in the office are also crying at this speech. The office was the Walter Mondale campaign headquarters. And these were Mondale's staff, right? And as one of them later put it, he said, "We knew then we can't beat this guy," right? But there's a serious point there. That's how powerful he was in appealing to the best of our country, that even his sworn political opponents like that would literally be moved to tears because of the vision he represented for America. And so I think that's something to remember now in our very poisonous and toxic atmospheres. We've got some wonderful values to appeal to in this country, a wonderful history there. And that's the kind of thing that can bring us together, even with some people who disagree with us very viciously politically.
Well, and he went on to win 49 states, which is staggering. But in 1960, nobody probably thought, hey, in 24 years, in 60, where there's such a divided election, a lot of shenanigans, 24 years later, there's that kind of victory. So it at least in theory, could happen again. Question up front.
Yeah. Bill, thanks again. And I got to tell you, as a child that grew up in the 80s, and you're absolutely rings true that no one really knew whether or not the Soviet system was going to collapse in the early days of that. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious as you were studying the Reagan papers, what was his view on China at that time? Because the Soviet system and Soviet economic system is so different. We call them communists, but they're very different systems. And so I'm just kind of wondering, what were the thoughts within his administration and his mind about China during that period?
Yeah, great question. I'll try to answer it briefly because there's a lot there. So first is President Reagan was clear on his values of standing with free countries against communist tyranny. And so that's why he was very supportive of Taiwan. Okay, you always have to start with that. He'd been very critical of the Carter administration for switching recognition from Taiwan to China. And so when he first comes into office, he's clear, we've got to first restore our ties, our support, our partnership with Taiwan, keep our arms sales going to them. So he always starts with that. But he was also clear in setting strategic priorities. He knew that his big priority was defeating the Soviet Union. And he eventually said, if that's my big priority, I'll work with anyone else who will come along with me on that. And so that's why he, building on Nixon and Kissinger's opening to China 8 years earlier, he did partner with China against the greater threat of the Soviet Union, right? And China at that point had become an adversary of the Soviet Union, partly on some cultural grounds and partly just, Marxists can't get along with each other, let alone anyone else, right? And so China was key to the Reagan doctrine operations in Afghanistan, elsewhere. President Reagan visited China in 1984, and it's really remarkable to read the speeches that he gave there, where he knows very clearly this is a communist tyranny. And he gives these wonderful speeches encouraging them to reform and open up their economy, which they were starting to do and they continue to do, and also encouraging them to embrace democracy, human rights, religious freedom. And they didn't take to that part so well. But so he was very consistent in his values with them, but also was pragmatic about sometimes you need to work with them for a time when you're dealing with a much greater threat.
You mentioned faith. Well, let's close. I'll make one closing comment in a moment, but let's close on your brief perspective on President Reagan's faith and how that shaped his decision making.
Yeah. Another really important theme in the book, and a surprise in my research, and you'll see this sprinkled throughout, but President Reagan had a much more deep, sincere, committed Christian faith than I had appreciated when I started the project. And you see it manifest in a number of ways. It's partly where he gets his strength and his resolve to ignore all the political opposition and the low approval ratings at times and to stay the course, particularly with this more confrontational posture towards the Soviets, because ultimately he believes that because the Soviet Union's greatest vulnerability is not its economy, it's not its imperialism, it's its atheism, right? The fact that they were imprisoning Christians and Jews just for peaceful belief and worship, that they were trying to impose atheism on all of their satellite countries and their imperial projects. And he thought that, state-sponsored atheism like that is just wicked, but also just can't be sustained. So that's where it gives him an insight into the Soviet Union's real vulnerabilities, but also gives him a lot of personal strength with his near death from the assassination attempt, with some of the real challenges of the Cold War. And one of the most, to my mind, touching parts of the book came in Reagan's last summit meeting with Gorbachev. This is in Moscow in May of 1988. Soviet Union is already starting to weaken and crumble. Gorbachev is trying to do some more reforms. Reagan has built a real partnership with him. They've signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. And reading the transcripts of their meetings together, a lot of it's still on arms control and trade and some of the other difficult issues in the Cold War. But Reagan spends quite a bit of time, about an hour, in a one-on-one meeting with Gorbachev, trying to persuade Gorbachev to believe in God. Reagan was deeply grieved that this man that he'd built this partnership with was an atheist. And Gorbachev invokes Reagan's son's own atheism as a challenge. Yeah. And then Reagan says, and I'm sad about my son being an atheist too. And he tells some different, he says, what I'd like to do is have a really gourmet meal prepared for my son and have my son come out and eat that meal and just see how wonderful and sumptuous and delicious it is. And then have my son tell me, oh, there's no cook. Right, no cook for the meal. And he says, how can we look at this beautiful, marvelous, incredible world that we live in, the universe, the expanse of it that we see every night, and not think that there's a God? And Gorbachev, I don't think he comes around to believe in God, but he's really touched by this. He sees that this American leader who's sworn to defeating the evil system that Gorbachev presides over also cares about him as a human being enough to speak so much about his personal faith. So again, it just gave me a lot more appreciation for the depth of Reagan's character and his own spirituality. So the book concludes with a sentence from one of President Reagan's final speeches, and I think it's a very fitting call to action for us today, a call to action for those of us in this room. And I'll read it, and then we'll conclude. But it says, "The work of freedom is never done, and the task of the peacemaker is never complete." So with that, let's thank Will, Kathy, Maureen.
Thank you very much. And if you would like to buy a book, we have some books for sale, and we'll sign them for you.